The two of the greatest powers in the Mediterranean were engaged in war for 8 long years, a conflict that broke out in 264 BCE when both Rome and Carthage intervened in a quarrel between Syracuse and the Mamertines in Messana. The war evolved from a small regional conflict into a relentless fight for the ultimate control of Sicily. The Romans soon realized that there was no way of winning the war on land, and they took to the seas. An entire fleet was constructed from the captured wreckage of a Carthaginian ship. With this brand new fleet in hand, the Romans engaged the Carthaginians and miraculously, against all odds, they came out on top. With this newfound supremacy on the seas, the Romans decided to bring the war to Carthage and invade North Africa. In 256 BC, the Romans, under the leadership of Lucius Manlius Vulso and Marcus Atilius Regulus, assembled a massive fleet and set sail for Africa. But before the crossing, the Romans would have to clear the seas in possibly the greatest naval conflict in history, the Battle of Cape Ecnomus in 256 BC. After a hard-fought battle, the Carthaginian fleet was destroyed and the way to Africa was cleared. The Romans stopped in Sicily for a short time to regain their strength and repair the damaged ships. When the fleet was finally ready, they set sail for Africa. They encountered no resistance during the crossing, and they landed on Cape Bon near the city of Aspis. The Romans dragged their ships onto land and built a fortified camp around them. When this was done, they besieged Aspis and took it with ease. The consul sent news of the events to the Senate, set up a garrison in Aspis, and proceeded to plunder the surrounding areas. These were some of the most fertile lands in Carthaginian possession, and the Romans gathered large amounts of plunder, capturing 20,000 slaves in the process. A message came from the Senate ordering one consul to return the navy to Rome and the other to stay with the army. Vulso took back the bulk of the ships along with the spoils and captured slaves, while Regulus stayed behind with the army. He was left with 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 ships at his disposal. The Carthaginians panicked when they realized that the legions were here to stay. They assembled all the available forces in Carthage. Hasdrubal, the son of Hanno, and Bostar were elected generals, while Hamilcar was recalled from Sicily. The three generals held joint control of the army, and following Hasdrubal's directions, they set off to stop the Romans from ravaging the countryside. While the Carthaginians were preparing their defenses, Regulus was capturing one town after another until he reached Adis. Adis was the first larger and better fortified city on their way, and the Romans began constructing siege engines. When the Carthaginian force reached them, they encamped on a small nearby hill. Polybius is highly critical of this move, as positioning themselves on a hill nullified their greatest advantages, cavalry and war elephants. Regulus must have realized this mistake and chose to capitalize on it. In the night he ordered his men to march on the Carthaginian camp from two sides. At daybreak the attack from one side started. As predicted, the cavalry and the elephants were completely useless on the uneven terrain, but the mercenaries were more than a match for the legions. They fought off the attack and pursued the fleeing legions, but they were attacked from the rear by the other part of the Roman army. Seeing the group of mercenaries destroyed, the rest of the Punic army broke and fled to safety. The Romans followed up their success by taking Tunis and turning it into a raiding base. While this Roman invasion was taking place in the east, the Carthaginians had further trouble in the west. The war with the Numidian princes was not going in their favor, and a large number of refugees from both sides flooded the city. Carthaginians, now twice defeated both on sea and on land, opened peace negotiations. Polybius claims that it was Regulus who initiated the talks, hoping to end the war before his year in office expired, but other ancient sources don't agree with this. Regulus proposed a ludicrous string of demands on the Carthaginians, which included abandoning Sicily and Syracuse, paying war reparations and an annual tribute, and limiting the navy to only one warship. Dio Cassius presents these terms, but considering that sources predating him, including Polybius, don't mention them, they are dubious at best. These demands were akin to an unconditional surrender, but although Carthage was bested in the field, they were far from total defeat. The terms were of course rejected, and in the winter of 255 the Carthaginians rebuilt their force, this time employing a number of Greek mercenaries. Among these Greeks was a man called Xantippus. He was a Spartan-trained mercenary leader with considerable experience. Upon hearing what had happened at Adis, he criticized the Carthaginian commanders. These comments reached the ears of the generals, and he was summoned to explain himself. Xantippus told them that their greatest power was the cavalry and elephants. This advantage could only be exploited if the Carthaginians stayed on open fields and engaged the Romans on such favorable terrain. Seeing the wisdom in his words, Xanthippus was entrusted with the command of the army. At once he implemented a stricter training regimen, and the quality of the army along with their morale was improved considerably. After he estimated that the army was ready, he marched out of the city with 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and nearly 100 war elephants. When the Romans saw this army marching on open fields, they were surprised but eager for another fight. The two armies encamped near each other. Men in the Punic camp, now completely embracing Xanthippus as their leader, were loudly calling for a battle. For his part, Xanthippus urged the three generals to not waste this opportunity, and on the next day they took to the field. The Romans gladly answered, and the Battle of Tunis started. The Carthaginian infantry consisted of a citizen militia that formed a Greek-style phalanx. They were placed in the center and formed the core of the army. The rest of the infantry were the mercenaries who were placed on their right. The cavalry was split between the two wings. And finally, utilizing their full potential, the war elephants were positioned in front of the infantry in a single line. However, this line of elephants didn't cover the entire infantry, and the mercenaries on the right had a clear path to the Romans. Xanthippus is given the full credit for this formation. On the other side, the Romans formed into a modified triple-line formation, with what little cavalry they had divided between the wings. Polybius mentions that the legions were formed many maniples deep, but it's unclear what he really meant by this. Some authors interpret this as the Roman forming into more than the three usual lines, but this is unlikely. A more probable explanation is that each of the three standard lines was packed into more ranks than usual. The greatest threat that the war elephants posed was to the wavering morale of the front line. Seeing a giant beast charging towards you was more than enough to break even the heartiest of men. Thus, a deeper formation made it harder for the men in the first line to escape, and they held their ground. The battle started with Xanthippus ordering an elephant charge. The weakest part of the Roman army was the cavalry on the wings, and they were quickly put to flight by the Carthaginians, who outnumbered them at least 4-1. The Roman left avoided the elephant charge, and they clashed with the mercenaries. They were quickly broken and pursued all the way to the camp. In the meantime, the Roman right stood their ground against the elephant charge, but many men were killed and trampled trying to fight off this onslaught. Few of the Roman maniples managed to pass through the elephants, but already exhausted, they were struck down by the citizen phalanx. Their day turned from bad to worse when the Carthaginian cavalry charged them from the rear. The Romans, stuck between the hammer and an anvil, were utterly destroyed. Regulus and a small contingent of 500 men managed to break through the Punic ranks and make their escape, but they were quickly captured. Out of the approximately 15,000 Romans, only 2,000 men, who made the initial breakthrough on the left, survived and retreated to Aspis. Polybius mentions that 800 mercenaries died, but doesn't provide the numbers for the rest of the Carthaginian force. The Battle of Tunis was the single greatest use of elephants in battle during the whole of the Punic Wars. They not only won the day, but had a great psychological effect on the Romans, who avoided open conflict in Sicily at all costs. In the aftermath of the battle, Xanthippus left Carthage and went on to serve under Ptolemies in Egypt. It's unclear precisely why he left, but it's believed that jealousy from his Punic counterparts had a role to play in his exile. Here we come to another instance of mythical Roman storytelling. According to one tradition, Regulus was sent to Rome to negotiate the ransom of the prisoners, but he was oath-bound to return. He urged the Senate to refuse the terms and return to Carthage, knowing full well what awaited him there. Another source claims that his wife was given 2 prominent Carthaginian prisoners, whom she tortured as retribution. All of these claims were probably made after his death, in order to build a myth around the famous family member. By our best account, he probably died of natural causes in captivity. The Romans, hearing the news of the disaster in Libya, sent a fleet in 255 to rescue their men from Aspis. 350 Roman ships with more than 300 transports sailed from Sicily, but they were intercepted by 200 Carthaginian quinqueremes. The Punic fleet was easily defeated and 114 ships were captured. The fleet proceeded to Aspis and evacuated the men stationed there. The whole fleet, now numbering 464 ships, sailed to Sicily without interruptions. The consuls decided to parade their fleet off the coast of Sicily in hopes of encouraging hostile cities to switch sides. This was against the advice of senior naval officers who warned of sudden storms that time of year. Their warnings were ignored and the fleet was caught in a terrible storm off the coast of Camarina in mid-July. Out of the 464 warships, 384 were sunk, along with 300 troop transports. Actually, the ancient sources don't completely agree on the true number of ships, but this was without a doubt one of the greatest naval disasters in history. It's estimated that 25,000 soldiers and 70,000 sailors perished. The sinking of the ships is often blamed on the Corvus. The heavy drawbridge secured to the front of the ships must have made the whole thing unstable. After this disaster, there is no mention of Corvus being used anymore, but it's entirely possible that they were not removed immediately, but rather phased out gradually. The Carthaginians, reinvigorated by their victory and this great disaster, started the construction of a new fleet. Hasdrubal and his army, along with 140 war elephants, were sent to Sicily. They arrived safely to Lilybaeum, and Hasdrubal took to drilling the army, no doubt learning a thing or two from his Greek counterpart. The next year, in 254 BCE, the Romans rebuilt their fleet. The consul Scipio Asina, who has the honor of the first Roman naval defeat of the war, and Aulus Atilius Cayatinus, took the new fleet numbering 220 ships and sailed off to Messana. There they linked up with the land armies and the 80 or so ships that survived the storm. Together, these two forces marched on Panormus and took it after breaching the outer walls. Tyndaris and much of the cities in inland western Sicily now sided with the Romans. From here, the land activity in Sicily died down. Although Hasdrubal tried to force the conflict with the Romans on several occasions, they refused to engage as the threat of war elephants still loomed large. The Romans exploited their superiority at sea and in 253 launched a series of raids on the African coast. The raids were successful and the ships laden with plunder returned, first to Sicily and then to Italy. On their way to Rome, the fleet was caught in yet another storm and 150 ships were sunk. These disasters were too much even for the Roman Senate, and they had to scale back on their naval ambitions. For a time, the remaining ships were used only as support for the land forces, but this state of affairs wouldn't last for long as the Romans would soon return to building new ships. In 252, two Punic strongholds, Thermae and Lipara, now isolated after the fall of Panormus, were captured. Seeing that their Sicilian possessions were shrinking by the day, Hasdrubal decided to act. In the winter of 251, one of the Roman consuls returned to Rome with half of the army, while the other was wintering in Panormus. When Hasdrubal learned of this, he brought the whole of his force to Panormus. The Carthaginians ravaged the fields around the city, and when they crossed the river close to Panormus, the Romans formed outside of the walls to meet them. A great number of skirmishers were placed in trenches around the city, and the citizens were ordered to supply them with missiles. When the elephants approached this trench, they were showered with missiles from all sides. Although they couldn't really hurt the elephants, the skirmishers succeeded in scaring them off. They turned around in a frenzy and rushed away from the Romans, stampeding right through the friendly line, trampling a great deal of men. The Romans now rushed out and defeated the remaining Carthaginians. There are no credible sources on the number of casualties in this battle. Some later authors claim that the Carthaginians lost 20 to 30,000 men, but this has to be a gross exaggeration. Polybius claims that in the aftermath of the battle, the Romans captured all Carthaginian elephants commanded by Hasdrubal. After the battle, the Romans were reinvigorated once more. Having conquered their fear of elephants, they were now on the offensive. In 250 BCE, the Romans led a combined land and naval force to Lilybaeum. Diodorus claims that the Romans numbered a combined 110,000 men. On their march west, they captured the remaining Punic holdouts on the island, reducing them to only two strongholds in the far west, Lilybaeum and Drepana. By this stage of the war, the Romans mastered the art of siegecraft, and from the onset, they constructed great siege engines that wouldn't be out of place in the Hellenistic world. For their part, the Carthaginians mounted a great defense of the city. Leader of the garrison, Hamilco, commanded a force of 10,000 mercenaries. Rather than wait for the Romans to breach the walls and storm the city, the defenders took proactive measures. They would tunnel under the walls to undermine the siege engines, perform nighttime raids to burn the exposed equipment, and carry out a host of other necessary precautions. Although heavily outnumbered, the small Carthaginian garrison would hold out until the very end of the war. The land forces were thus locked in a standstill, and all the action was again back on the seas. At the start of the siege, the Roman fleet blockaded the port of Lilybaeum, knowing that the only way of taking the city was starving it out. 50 ships were sent from Carthage to aid the city. They sailed to Agatis Islands and there waited for an opportune moment. When the favorable winds arose, the fleet sailed right past the Roman patrol and into the harbor. The fleet brought in 10,000 fresh troops along with the much-needed supplies. The sailors were not brazen enough to attempt this again, and they waited for the cover of darkness to leave the city, bringing the cavalry with them. The Romans, now on high alert, prevented any further large-scale resupply missions. At this time, Hannibal the Rhodian rose to the occasion and single-handedly evaded the Roman patrol and entered Lilybaeum. He used the same tactic as the previous fleet. He stationed himself on the Aegatis Islands, and when the winds were in his favor, sailed into the harbor in full view of the Romans. 10 of the fastest Roman ships were positioned at the entrance to the port, hoping to catch the Rhodian. The next day, he left the port as if the Romans weren't there at all. Sailing past them, Hannibal wasn't content with simply evading the Romans, but he was bent on humiliating them as well. He stopped his ship a short distance away and dared the Romans to chase after him. None of the 10 ships dared to move, and Hannibal sailed off to safety. This little stunt emboldened other skilled Punic captains, and they would periodically enter the town bringing news and fresh supplies. The Romans threw large boulders and debris into the sea, hoping to block the passage. One of the quicker Punic quadriremes ran aground on this debris, and it was captured by the Romans. The Romans then used this fast ship to finally catch the Rhodian and his ship. These two exceptionally well-made Punic ships were then used to finally seal off the entrance to Lilybaeum. The Romans now decided to launch a surprise attack on the other Carthaginian stronghold in Sicily, Drepana. Publius Claudius Pulcher was elected consul for the year 249 BC. He was the grandson of the famous Appius Claudius Caecus, who built the Appian Way and opposed peace with Pyrrhus of Epirus in his old age. Claudius sailed the fleet north from Lilybaeum, hoping to surprise the Carthaginians. Before the battle, he consulted the sacred chickens, as was customary in the Roman world. The chickens were given food but refused to eat. This was an obvious bad omen, and Claudius should have abandoned the attack, at least for that day. Furious, he threw the sacred chickens off board, proclaiming, "If they are not hungry, maybe they are thirsty." The gods would not suffer such insults being hurled at the sacred chickens, and the Romans were punished with a great naval disaster. Claudius led his fleet to Drepana, hoping to trap the enemy fleet, but they were spotted. Adherbal, the Punic admiral, set a trap and waited for the Romans to close in. In front of the harbor, there were a couple of small islands, making 2 narrow corridors, one to the left and one to the right. When the Romans entered one of these corridors, the whole of the Punic fleet rushed out through the second corridor. Realizing what had happened, the Romans tried to maneuver their ships and form a solid line facing the Carthaginians. But the Punic ships were faster and had better crews. Adherbal sailed at the head of the fleet and enveloped the Romans, pinning them to the shore. Carthaginians finally utilized their naval superiority and crushed the Roman fleet. Claudius was on one of the rare ships that managed to escape. 93 Roman ships were captured along with their crews. Polybius makes no mention of the Corvus, and it's possible that the Roman ships didn't use it in this battle. The Punic ships were not afraid to charge in between the Romans, and this could be a sign that the Ravens were not present on board. The recent disasters on the sea might have discouraged the Romans from using them. When he returned to Rome, Claudius was put on trial for his reckless actions, and he barely escaped with his life, only having to pay a hefty fine. After winning their first big naval engagement of the war, the Carthaginians were now on the offensive. Carthalo, another Punic admiral, sailed to Sicily with 70 new ships from Carthage. He was reinforced by Adherbal with a further 30 ships. With this fleet, he sailed to Lilybaeum and there destroyed most of the ships maintaining the blockade. After this success, he sailed on along the Sicilian shore, hoping to intercept the Roman fleet. The Romans, unaware of the recent disasters, sent a fleet of 120 warships and 800 transports to resupply the besiegers of Lilybaeum. The fleet had trouble crossing into Sicily and they split apart. The consul sent quaestors with half the transports and a few warships ahead, while he stayed behind in Syracuse waiting for the stragglers to catch up. After sailing a good distance from the main body of the fleet, the quaestors got word of the Punic ships headed their way. They lacked the strength to face them or the speed to outrun them. The only option they had left was to come ashore and build defenses around the ships. The Romans took catapults from a nearby town and positioned them around the ships. These rudimentary fortifications were enough to deter the Carthaginians from engaging, and they continued on their way. The consuls, with the rest of the fleet, set off from Syracuse. They rounded the Cape Aquinas and stumbled upon the Carthaginian fleet. He was unwilling to engage them, so he sailed close to the rugged coast of Sicily. Carthalo didn't follow him but watched from a distance. The Punic fleet was full of experienced captains who knew these waters. When they noticed that a storm was brewing, they advised Carthalo to sail around the cape and he agreed, leaving the Romans in perilous waters. A great storm arose and completely destroyed both parts of the fleet. This disaster was more complete for the Romans than the previous ones. After their first big naval defeat and another fleet lost to a storm, the Romans completely abandoned all action at sea. It's likely that Rome lacked funds to build yet another fleet, and they were again locked into fighting on land. Even though they now lacked naval support, the Romans didn't abandon the siege of Lilybaeum. The city was again easily resupplied by sea, and it would stand until the end of the war. To save face, the consul who lost the fleet led an attack on Mount Eryx, the second tallest mountain on Sicily. There the Carthaginians held the grandest and richest of all the Greek temples on the island. Eryx was captured and a Roman garrison was installed. It is now that the most famous general of the war took command of the Carthaginian army. In the year 247 BCE, the Carthaginians sent Hamilcar Barca into Sicily. Hamilcar is one of the greatest Carthaginian commanders, second only to his son Hannibal. Although he is mostly known for his actions after the war, he still had a part to play in this conflict. Upon taking command of the fleet, he raided both Locri and the southern tip of Italy. Satisfied with the collected booty, he made landfall in Sicily. He and his small force occupied Mount Pellegrino, a hill near Panormus, deep inside enemy territory. From there, Hamilcar launched frequent hit-and-run attacks on the Roman garrison. Meanwhile, the authorities in Carthage were now shifting their focus from Sicily to North Africa. The Numidian princes were once again rising up in revolt against Carthaginian rule. Hanno the Great, who was against the war with Rome from the very beginning, now held sway over the Senate. Hanno had considerable holdings in North Africa and Iberia, and he was in favor of continuing the westward expansion of Carthage. Because of him, Hamilcar was given only a small army and no funds to hire additional mercenaries. The Punic navy was also gradually withdrawn from Sicily, leaving Hamilcar stranded on the island. Interestingly, Hanno led the anti-war faction during the Second Punic War, and he was the main reason Hannibal received no support from Carthage while in Italy. Likewise, in Rome, the people were getting tired of the war. Countless lives and funds were poured into this conflict with only limited success. The Gauls were again stirring in the north, and Roman efforts in Sicily were dwindling. It was in this reduced capacity that Hamilcar Barca harassed the Romans for 3 years. He was mostly successful but lacked the manpower for any meaningful gains. In 244 BCE, Hamilcar saw the opportunity and recaptured Eryx, turning it into a new base of operations. This position was less defensible than his previous base, but nevertheless he successfully held out for another 3 years, inflicting further damage to the Romans. The two sides were thus locked in a standstill, and the Romans realized that they would have to take to the seas once more. After so many ships were lost, first at sea, then at the hands of the Carthaginians at Drepana, the Roman treasury was completely empty. Fortunately, the patriotic Roman citizens stepped forth and funded the construction of a brand new fleet. The wealthiest citizens paid for construction and equipment of 200 quinqueremes in total, hoping to be repaid after the war was concluded. According to reports, this loan was interest-free, meaning that the Roman elites really did see themselves as an extension of the state. Although Polybius claims this fleet consisted of quinqueremes, or fives, it was most likely constructed by copying the design of captured quadrireme, or four. The captured ship in question is the one sailed by Hannibal the Rhodian at Lilybaeum. It was chosen for its sleeker design and higher speed. These ships were of exceptionally good quality. Years of making new fleets from scratch made the Roman shipbuilders masters of their crafts. When the fleet was ready in 242 BCE, the Romans sailed to Sicily under the command of the consul admiral Gaius Lutatius Catulus. Their first order of business was cutting the supply lines to Hamilcar's forces, leaving him in a precarious position. Catulus desired a great sea battle with the Carthaginians, believing that was the only way of truly defeating them. He took great care to exercise his men, leading them to sea every day. The men were given extra rations to keep them in great shape. By 241 BCE, the fleet was in supreme condition. It was by far the greatest fleet yet assembled by the Romans. When the Carthaginians heard the news of this fleet, they had to act. Considering that the Carthaginian navy had been out of service for the past few years, it took them some time to muster the 250 ships. Experienced sailors weren't readily available, so the ships were manned by fresh recruits. It's also possible that the ships were understaffed. Command of the navy was given to Hanno, possibly the one who suffered prior defeats in Agrigentum and Ecnomus. His ships were loaded with grain, and his main task was to reach Sicily and resupply the armies there. He would then take Hamilcar and his men on board and attack the Romans. Hanno led his fleet to Agatis Islands and there waited for favorable winds, hoping to slip into Lilybaeum unnoticed. However, Catulus got word of this. He took additional men on board to serve as marines and rushed to the Agatis Islands. The two fleets were anchored off neighboring islands, facing each other. On the 10th of March 241 BCE, favorable winds arose from the west and the Carthaginians set sail for Lilybaeum. Catulus was now presented with a difficult decision. If he engaged the Carthaginians, his men would have to fight the rough seas in addition to enemy vessels. But if he let them pass, the ships would be boarded with the best troops Hamilcar had on hand. Catulus chose to trust in the training of his men and he sent a signal to engage. The Carthaginians answered by forming up in a line ready to fight. For the first time in the war, the Romans had better trained sailors and faster, more maneuverable ships. This discrepancy was soon evident and the Punic fleet was crushed. Luckily, during the battle the wind changed direction, allowing the surviving Carthaginians to escape. The Romans sank 50 Punic ships and captured a further 70, while they lost 30 with another 50 crippled. 10,000 Carthaginians were captured, a relatively small amount considering the number of captured ships. This could be evidence that the Punic ships were understaffed. Defeat at the Battle of Agatis Islands was one too many for the Carthaginians, and they had to sue for peace. Polybius claims that they lacked funds for constructing a new fleet, and without a fleet, their armies in Sicily couldn't hold out for much longer. Hamilcar, who hadn't lost a single battle, was given full authority to negotiate peace with the Romans. In the end, it was agreed that the Carthaginians would completely abandon Sicily and all the islands between it and Africa, return all Roman prisoners for free while ransoming their own, and pay an indemnity to Rome. 1,000 talents were to be paid immediately, with a further 2,200 over the next 10 years. For comparison, some estimates put the cost of the 20,000-strong Carthaginian mercenary army at around 2,000 talents a year. Suddenly, the war that raged on for 24 years was now finally over. The First Punic War was by far the largest and the most expensive war the Romans fought up to that point. Census figures in Rome showed that the population of the city was reduced by 50,000, or about 17%, during the course of the war. These figures only account for the citizens of Rome itself. Countless more allies have perished in this prolonged conflict. According to Polybius, the Romans lost about 700 ships, mostly in storms, while the Carthaginians lost around 500. As we have already mentioned, these numbers are somewhat disputed, but in any case the number of lost ships and sailors were staggering. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, put it bluntly: "It is the longest, the most continuous, and the greatest conflict that we have knowledge of." In the end, the Romans achieved their ultimate goal, gaining complete control over Sicily. While fighting wars in Italy, the Romans would usually absorb the conquered people, sometimes giving them Roman citizenship and usually leaving them to their own devices. These conquered people then had one simple but important obligation: providing men for the Roman army. Sicily was far too large and distant to apply the same principles of conquest. Instead, Sicily became the first Roman province, or a territory outside Italy under Rome's direct rule. In contrast to Italian allies, the provinces didn't have to provide men for the army, but rather pay taxes to Rome. Governors were appointed periodically to rule over the provinces and extract taxes from their respective territories. Soon the grain coming in from Sicily became a major source of food for Rome itself, making many aristocrats in charge of its distribution exceptionally wealthy. Control of Sicily brought with it control of the sea routes, and after the war, the Romans emerged as the de facto rulers of the Western Mediterranean. Naval experience gained through the war would later play a crucial part in the Roman expansion out of Italy. The foundations of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean for the next 600 years were laid in these hard years. During the war, the Romans once again showed their capacity for aggressive action. An entire army lost in Africa, 3 fleets completely destroyed by storms, and 1 fleet lost in battle did nothing to deter the Romans from prosecuting the war. In the ancient world, only one of these disasters would be enough to convince any sensible nation to sue for peace. But the Romans were far from sensible. As we have seen time and time again, and as we will see countless more times in this series, the loss of an entire army was just a small setback for the Romans. They wouldn't even stop to mourn their losses, but simply raise another army. These armies would keep coming until their enemy had to sue for peace from sheer exhaustion. On the other hand, the Carthaginians were willing to endure this, but only to a point. Losses underground were suffered by the mercenaries and not the citizens of Carthage. This allowed the generals to lose countless men without raising alarm back at home. But losses to their fleet were the one thing the Carthaginians could not bear. Loss of ships meant a loss of trading profits, and when the war started hurting the income of the rich elites, it was time to end it. For his loyalty and service during the war, Hiero was promised a lifetime alliance with Rome. Syracuse and its zone of influence were now firmly under Roman protection. After the war, Hamilcar Barca left Sicily, leaving the Carthaginians to deal with the unpaid mercenaries. They ignored the first rule of dealing with the mercenaries and refused to pay them what was owed. This foolish decision resulted in a ruthless civil war that lasted 3 years and cost Carthage far more than the initial owed sum. This war was fought with unrivaled brutality, and Polybius called it the Truceless War. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Romans were now in a much better position. Indemnity paid by the Carthaginians was used to pay off the debt incurred by the construction of the latest fleet. The Romans would go on to use their newly gained naval supremacy to expand their influence over the Mediterranean. They conquered Sardinia and Corsica in the west and destroyed the Illyrian pirates in the east. Victories on sea were then followed by the victories on land, and the Romans finally crushed the Celts in the north and expanded their territory to Cisalpine Gaul. Join us next time as we discuss the interwar period and the inevitable march towards the Second Punic War.